I'm what's called a papyrologist. That is, I study ancient papyri, mainly in Greek. These are our oldest surviving manuscripts from Greco-Roman antiquity, dating from around 300 BCE to 700 CE.
So what I do, my area is I look at ancient Greek mythology. That's my specialism. I look at that in terms of ancient Greek texts and also in classical reception. So I'm currently finishing off my PhD in classical studies, looking at Chiron the Centaur in both ancient Greek texts and in modern literary reception from 1840 onwards.
I'm very interested in the fall of the Roman Republic from maybe from a class perspective. I'm interested in the biases and prejudices of the authors who wrote about the end of the Republic and the way that those personal biases have skewed the reporting of certain events in the end that led to the fall of the Republic. I'm also interested in the way that working class voices have been shut out from a lot of the history in that period. It's the same thing which informs my working practice. I'm always interested in why people from a certain economic background get shut out.
The Medea Project is a theater company, but it is made up of women, ex-offenders, social workers, midwives, artists and activists, writers, choreographers. I was asked to come into the jails and teach aerobics to incarcerated women. And I realized that they weren't interested in aerobics. They were a bit snarly. And so I thought, well, what I will do is that I will perform for them. This young woman, Regina, said to me, "Why are you telling us your business? Why are you sharing such personal stuff with us?" And I said, well, I'm an artist who is invested in a community and a conversation that may very well create a road for you all out of jail back to your families if we can build it with words and stories and memory. And it has become the basis for my work with the Medea Project.
My corner of classical studies is classical reception studies. And so this is a subfield of the bigger discipline that looks at relationships between the ancient and the modern, broadly speaking. So my research specialism is thinking about 20th century German and English philosophy and thinking about how thinkers who are much closer to us in time take up the ideas, the myths, and the frameworks from the ancient world. So I'm interested in cultural difference as well as thinking about how we got to the ideas that we have via mobilizations of classical thought.
As a curator at Manchester Museum, I look after our collection of 18,000 objects from ancient Egypt and Sudan. I was trained as an Egyptologist, and one of the best parts of the job is being able to communicate the collection and ideas that come out of the collection to a broad audience of our visitors and people who use Egyptian material.
We settled in upstate New York. And in settling on a farm, a dirt farm in the country with 12 children, well, actually, that was 8 of us. The older ones had left already. The farmers would bring my father boxes of books. And in those boxes were books of the classics. That's when I first got a look at Persephone, Demeter. This was like very, very early. And being an African American girl, and at that time I was probably 8 or 9 years old, and all of us were looking at these books, and they were beautifully done. I mean, beautiful drawings. And this was the entree into the classics. So I say that to say that I didn't grow up and say, I'm going to go to school and study classical literature. Classical literature found me.
I came rather late to classics. I initially went to university to study music and only began learning Greek and then Latin on the side out of curiosity. And I became more and more intrigued by classical Greek culture and had a great desire to learn the language. And so that's what drove me to explore it further.
So I came to classical studies sort of through the back door after doing all my qualifications in English literature. So I'd always loved books, but I'd also always been interested in the ancient world. But I ended up in English lit, and then when I came to work at the Open University, I decided that I'd do some modules for fun, and started with some classical studies modules, and that's how I've ended up here.
I was working in the Highlands in Scotland, and we had an exceptional pupil who had basically finished all of the courses that she could do. So my head teacher asked me to guide her through higher classical studies. And as I was guiding this pupil through, it was like a one-to-one session twice a week. I realized that I had enjoyed classics in a different form when I was younger, but I really wanted to take it on myself. And in a way that teenagers often do, she very casually said, well, what's stopping you? So I went back and I started, I did higher classical studies, higher Latin, and then took up the baton with the Open University.
I loved reading myths from all over the world when I was a kid, in storybooks, in the first short fiction that I read, and then the Greeks and Romans were just one of many different cultures whose myths I really enjoyed. And then I had the opportunity to learn Latin at school, and my mind really enjoyed the systemization of learning about a different culture. And when I realized, and it was quite late in the day, that you could study this thing at university, I jumped at the chance to learn another language. So I learned ancient Greek, and that was my route in. It was a very clear line, actually, from myth to language to being able to do more of this.
I came to classical studies in, I think, not a conventional route. I wasn't at school. I was at a comprehensive, didn't have anything as fancy as that. It was through television, actually, BBC children's television. 2 programs, roughly early, mid-80s. At least that's my memory. One was this guy who I knew from Blackadder, Baldrick from Blackadder, Tony Robinson, on a beach somewhere, talking about these amazing myths, these great heroes, this massive battle at Troy, characters I'd never heard of before, Achilles, Agamemnon, Hector, focusing in on Odysseus. There was also, roughly at the same time, this Franco-Japanese, I think, animation called Ulysses 31, space age Odysseus traveling through the galaxy. There's a nice pop song that goes along with this, which I won't sing. And that was, again, just, wow, this is really funky stuff.
I trained as an Egyptologist, so I dealt with ancient Egypt, and I was a bit intimidated by ancient Greece and ancient Rome. But through my work as a museum curator and exhibition curator for our latest show, Golden Mummies of Egypt, which deals with Egypt under Greek and Roman rule, I have quite recently come to classical studies to understand Egyptian funerary culture as an exchange of ideas and images and beliefs between the Greek and the Roman and the Egyptian worlds. So I didn't start out being interested in classical studies, but I'm very much an enthusiast now. Classical studies, to me, is an attempt to understand the people who lived in the ancient Eastern Mediterranean, not just about Greece and Rome, but other cultures that they came into contact with, understanding cultural exchange, religion, society, language, literature, in a way to try and get closer to those ancient people and in a way to understand a little bit more about ourselves.
When you take these stories, and even a woman as simple as somebody in prison can make a connection because it's so large and varied. Even Jason and the organizers, even Jason's trip back home, and the boys, when I worked with boys, they understood it about going home and all of the things that they had met in reformatory school. The classics give our world a brighter and different light, I think. Coming from a creative such as myself, that's what I think it is.
Classical studies, for me, is a study of the Greco-Roman world in all its aspects. So material, literary, intellectual, linguistic, historical, and so on. And the relation of these aspects to each other as well. And it's also the reflection how that past interacts with our modern world and more recent history. I should say that I'm not a big fan of the word classics and classical, as it has a rather old-fashioned and misleading connotations. So the Greco-Roman world and its achievements were undeniably important and influential, but this doesn't mean that we should elevate them to the status of classics to the detriment of the kind of cultural productions of other ancient civilizations. I would prefer the more neutral term phrase, ancient Mediterranean, for example, or the like, to describe our area of study.
So I think classical studies, according to me, is the study of the ancient world and also things that have been inspired by it. So art and architecture and literature in terms of classical reception. And it's not just Greece and Rome. So often now it incorporates or is yoked to study of ancient Egypt and the ancient Near East. And there's a growing interest in how those ancient civilizations corresponded to and communicated with one another. But of course, that's a huge area, and departments have to decide on what they're going to focus on. And looking at Greece and Rome is absolutely the backbone of classical studies.
For me, classical studies is a gigantic case study of human behavior. It's a way to look at attitudes and faiths and predispositions that human beings have had in a completely different society to our own. So it's a way for us to look at ideas which might or might not be universal. When we look at certain ideas in the modern day, in the modern world, we still love people. In the ancient world, they love people, but it allows us to look at these ideas in a different context. And it allows us to get at the heart of what it is to be human.
Classical studies is the study of ancient Greece and Rome that has become important to the story that Europe tells itself. So classical studies can mean lots and lots of things, but this is the kind of central definition that it has come to mean. And I hope that some of the work that we do, that you'll be doing in your courses, will expand that definition beyond Greece and Rome to think about what else classical can do.